A formal welcome back to semester 2 of the Crime, Justice and Society Seminar series, and a very warm welcome to Dr. Amy Beddows, who is joining us for the first seminar of the semester with her presentation, Women's Experiences of Victim Blame from Agencies Following Sexual Violence. I'm just going to read the blurb again that Amy provided herself, just for anyone who's not had a chance just to read some of the emails and correspondence previously given. Amy recently completed her PhD in Women's Experiences of Victim Blame. Her research shows that victim blame stretches far beyond blame, with women being judged, devalued, and dehumanized for reasons other than their victimization. Agencies across all sectors, even those which are specialized to work with survivors of violence, can communicate blame and judgment through their staff, processes, and physical environments. In this seminar, Amy will discuss the findings of her research and the implications for survivors and for wider society, as well as her unique methodology of running return focus groups with survivors to sense check findings. So as with all the seminars for this series, I'll shortly let Amy take over, and she will have approximately 45 minutes to present. Thereafter, with the time that we have remaining, we'll open the floor for questions, and we will run a very simple process. If you have a question, write a Q in the chat. If you have a follow-up to a question that's been asked already and Amy is answering, you can write an F in the chat, and we will open the queue for questions as soon as Amy is finished and I take back over. Okay, Amy, I've talked enough. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be able to talk about my research. So yeah, as Grant said, my PhD, which I just finished at the end of last year, was looking at women's experiences of victim blame, particularly from professionals and agencies and services. So in terms of today, I'm going to talk a little bit, a brief overview of what victim blame is. Most people have heard of it, but it was kind of part of my research was interestingly to discover there wasn't a very clear definition of what it is and what it isn't and how it's communicated. And also this concept that became more relevant to the findings that I was getting from the women I spoke with, this idea of responsibilisation, which I hadn't heard of. It's horrible to say, it's horrible to spell, but it's a much more useful concept, I think, thinking about how professionals and agencies and systems actually respond to survivors of sexual violence. I'll then talk specifically about my research, a little bit then about the responsibilisation in criminal justice responses, as well as other agencies, and the implications for tackling violence against women. So essentially why this matters. And then, of course, there'll be time for a bit of a Q&A. Just to let you know, I'm recovering from a condition that comes with a huge amount of brain fog. So sometimes I don't always say the word I mean, and sometimes I'm not as clear as I could be. So please, if I say something that doesn't make sense, put it in the chat and I will revisit it. Because I still sometimes get a little lost in my thoughts. But in terms of who I am, I thought it'd be useful just to kind of locate myself within this research. So my background was in psychology. I'm a cognitive behaviour therapist, and I work primarily with people who've experienced trauma. I'm currently working in higher education at Edinburgh Napier University, just over the way, with students. And I tend to see students who've had experience of sexual violence, sexual assault, any kind of trauma of that kind. Prior to doing my PhD, I worked in America for a few years as a sexual violence victim advocate. So that gave me a different kind of perspective on working in this field. And then, as I said, I've just finished a PhD part-time, which was at the Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit, which is located at London Metropolitan University. And my supervisor was Professor Liz Kelly, just in case people are familiar with her work on the continuum and the conducive context to violence. So that influenced a lot of what I did. To start off with, as I said, one of the interesting things that came out of my literature review was trying to get a clear definition of what is victim blame. And the sort of standard overview of this concept is it's blaming victims or survivors for the misfortune they've experienced, finding them either partially or fully responsible. And when this term was first being used, it was in relation to lots of things, disease, accidents, poverty, or any kind of misfortune within society you can imagine. But it's become much more related to crime and to specifically sexual violence. That's how most people hear of it in reference to cases of sexual assault, rape, child abuse. And unsurprisingly, experiencing victim blame, so feeling blamed or thinking that people might blame us for what's happened to us, has many, many negative impacts, emotionally, psychologically, physically, financially, practically, socially, spiritually, any area of our lives you can imagine there being a negative impact, victim blame really can get in there and make things really difficult. And this is for people who are already trying to deal with a horrible thing that's happened to them. So it's a very important thing for us to look at. And one thing we do know, particularly from a criminal justice perspective, is if people are worried about being blamed, they often withdraw from support from places that can help them, and they may decide not to report. So often, you know, we hear women talking about, well, I didn't think I'd be believed, and what if I was blamed? There's this kind of general fear, not unfounded, that they're going to be met in a negative way, not just female survivors, male survivors as well, although I focus specifically on women, and I will talk about why I chose to do that in my research. So as well as all these negative impacts for individuals, it has a wider societal impact because it also absolves abusers. You know, if we're saying that it's a victim's fault that something happens to them, what does it mean about the person who commits the abuse or commits the crime? But also professionals. If we have professionals whose job is to prevent or support, and all the blame, all the focus, all the causality is put on the person who's been victimized, then again, the responsibility is not lying and where it should do, and it isn't shared. So it becomes a very individual issue rather than a societal one. And academics have referred to victim blame as being quite an integral part of things like rape culture, which is this concept that we live in a society where violence against women is normalized and enabled. And what Professor Kelly refers to as the conducive context for violence against women, which is just all the sort of structures, the factors, the assumptions, the attitudes that mean it happens and we don't do enough to prevent it, and we don't support victims enough after it's happened. And other academics have noted the strong connection with structural oppressions. So, for example, victim blame is linked really, really intrinsically to gender, but also to race and ethnicity, to age, to sexuality, to ability, to class and socioeconomic status. And this maintains a kind of a hierarchy of victims. So some people are seen as more credible and more deserving and less blameworthy, and other people, purely because of who they are seen as less. And so this creates a kind of a hierarchy of who's believed, who's supported, and who isn't. So from that perspective, you know, victim blame is a really big thing. It's worth looking at, and it's worth trying to figure out why we do it. How can we stop it? So this led to my research questions. As I say, that there wasn't a kind of consensus as to what is or isn't blame, or how it can be communicated, or how it's experienced. So my PhD, that was essentially what I wanted to do. In very CBT kind of style, I was like, well, how does it look in terms of cognitions, and how does it look in terms of behaviors, and how does it look in this? And I thought I'd come up with a lovely, neat sort of package of what is blame, how we can stop it, how we can support people who've been through it. So my research questions were looking at how it's communicated to and experienced by victim survivors. And are there specific things, particular behaviors, particular comments, or wider situational factors that are experienced as blaming? And also, are there less direct, more subtle ways that blame can be communicated or experienced? And that came from my work in the US, where a lot of the police officers in California where I was working, they wear these huge utility belts that have guns, tasers, handcuffs, torches, huge amounts of stuff, which means the only way a police officer can comfortably stand is with his arms crossed, kind of like up to his shoulders like that. And if you're someone who's been through a sexual assault and you're telling your story to a police officer who's got his arms crossed, a lot of women said they experienced that as being judged. It looked like their dad telling them off, you know, arms crossed, like I'm really fed up. But the police officer wasn't communicating an attitude. That was just how he had to stand because of all his gear. So I was thinking of that, thinking, gosh, that's so unintentional. And yet that's a really powerful message that's going to people that have been through something terrible and trying to get help. I wonder if there's other less direct, more subtle ways that blame is communicated unintentionally, was initially what I was really thinking. So I chose to focus on female victim survivors rather than looking at victim survivors from all genders. Partly that was the Child and Women Abuse Studies unit where I did my research. It's a very feminist-based unit, and a lot of the work they do is focused on women and children. And we know that women are more likely to be affected by sexual violence than men. You know, with the stats and with the information we have, we know that gender is quite a stark factor in these sorts of crimes. But also, if we're thinking that blame and judgments are going to be subject to certain attitudes towards victim survivors, male and female survivors are probably going to be, there's going to be different things going on. You know, the kind of blame that women who've experienced abuse may face is often different to the kind that men. So a common thing we hear from male victim survivors is, oh, why didn't you fight him off? We don't hear that as much from women. So there's gender specific blaming, and I thought, well, focusing on women would give us one picture. And I'm hoping as I move forward in my academic career, I'd love to do the same research again, but actually focusing on men to see where are the similarities and where are the differences in what I found. So to do this work, I ran focus groups with survivors through rape crisis centres, and that was partly to ensure that anyone who took part in the research was supported. They already had an agency that was working with them and making sure their needs were met. But it was also a really good way to actually meet women in their territory. So I went to the centres and I met with the women who came to the groups in their coffee rooms or their group rooms. So they knew the environment and I didn't, and I was the outsider coming in. And that felt just a bit more comfortable for them rather than asking them to come to me or them to come somewhere neutral. And a total of 36 women came along to the groups, which doesn't sound a lot for 10 groups. But what ended up happening, which I hadn't expected, was I ran follow-up focus groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Because the women wanted to come back and they wanted to meet again. So quite a few women came to more than one group, which is why the overall number is quite low. And I had a very open agenda in my advertising my research, and actually at the start of the groups, once I'd gone through the informed consent and confidentiality and all the important stuff, I just said, I just want to know what your experiences of agency responses have been like. So I didn't give a clear definition of what I meant by victim blame or what I meant by agencies. I wanted to leave it as open as possible so that I wouldn't shut down any avenues of exploration. Just which agencies did you have contact with and how was it, essentially? So yeah, as I say, interestingly, I allowed 1.5 to 2 hours for each of the groups. And in most of the groups we ran over because there was just so much people wanted to say, so many experiences they wanted to share. And some of the women said, well, can you come back? Can we meet with you again? And so I ended up doing that for 3 of the focus groups. I went back twice with the same participants, which was really interesting. It wasn't something I'd expected to do because my understanding of focus groups in this kind of research was almost like a one and done. You go, you meet with them, you get the data, brilliant, thanks very much. And then you go and you analyze it. So meeting the women again, it showed that there was more they'd wanted to talk about. They'd thought about it. They'd made the meaning they'd made of the experiences had changed between discussions because they heard what other women had been through and what sense they made of it. And so some women came back saying, actually, now I think about it, I think it's this. It allowed us to go much more deeper into the topic. And it was evident really from how the women were speaking that they felt more comfortable. There was a bit more familiarity and trust and rapport. And so the further the groups went, the more that was shared, which I think was really useful considering the topic. One group, the final group I ran, I had hoped to do more of these, but COVID, the pandemic kind of got in the way. I went back and I presented my early findings so I could say to the women, do you think I've got it right? This is what I'm thinking. This is what I've heard. And that was really useful because, again, they're able to say, yeah, that makes sense. I'm not so sure about that. I think you need to look more at this. And we also talked about ways that I could share findings that weren't just academic papers, conference presentations, you know, how they wanted their information and their stories shared. So that was really nice and felt quite participatory. And so having done these 10 groups, analysed the data, gone back and presented it, spoken with the women, come back, there were several key findings. And obviously when you write a 300-page thesis, trying to put your findings in very brief bullet points becomes challenging. But these were the things that really jumped out at me, which was victim blame is far, far more than blame. So I think in however many hours, 25 plus hours of focus group recordings I had, only 5 women mentioned feeling blamed specifically. And I thought, oh, great, victim blame is no longer a thing. Women aren't feeling blamed. But what they were describing was so many other negative and judgmental interactions with agencies and professionals and feeling not believed, feeling devalued. And then these concepts of victimism and responsibilisation started to come in and make sense to explain how women were treated. And I'll talk about these because, as I say, when I started this work, I wasn't familiar with this. But it was just really interesting that blame wasn't something that was coming up. Everything else was. And that the women themselves felt that what they were experiencing, whether it was blame, whether it was judgment, feeling dismissed, feeling devalued, it had less to do with the fact they'd experienced violence and it was more to do with who they were. So the women themselves said, I think it's because I was a woman, or I think it's because I was old, or I think it was because I was a lesbian, or because I was working class. They themselves linked it to these structural inequalities and these structural oppressions rather than the fact that they'd been through sexual violence, because some of the experiences they described, the professional didn't know that they'd experienced sexual violence. So it couldn't have been a reaction to that, but it was a reaction to something else. And it made me start to realize, well, looking at it in this way, victim blame is kind of a useless concept because it's not about victims and it's not really about blame. So something else is going on. And the concept is useful because we talk about it and you can see what it is. And particularly working in counseling agencies, as I have, you know, we can be mindful of, you've got to make sure you don't do it. You've got to kind of try and compensate for it, you know, really make victims know it's not their fault and you believe them. But actually, that's a tiny bit of the picture. We're missing so much other stuff that victim survivors of abuse are experiencing. And the key thing that came out of what worked, because thankfully a lot of the women described interactions that were really positive and experiences with agencies that really helped them, were all around this notion of space. So other academics have spoken about this idea of space for action, how we can create space which includes opportunities and options and resources and others willing to support people to do and take the steps they want, or to not have to do anything if they don't want. But also being given genuine spaces to speak where women felt supported and believed they'd actually be heard and respected. But also this idea of spaces to just be and be with. So one of the things that came up about rape crisis was how women could just go to coffee mornings or go and hang out and talk to a support worker. They didn't have to go for a counselling appointment or for a video interview. They could just go and they could just be. And that felt really respectful. And that felt that their needs were met and were valued, either on their own or with other women who'd been through similar experiences. And again, those are things that a lot of agencies can't provide because funding, budgets, resources, physical spaces, but that was something that was seen as really important. So to go back to this idea of victimism, if people are interested in this concept, Kathleen Barry, a feminist sociologist, I think she described herself as, she first spoke about this in her 1979 book, Female Sexual Slavery. And it's this idea that as society has become more aware of male violence against women, has become more accepting that it's a thing that happens, it's created this new status, which is the victim. So if we agree that sexual violence against women happens, then we create a victim as a concept and a status that we respond to. So when women are believed, and I've put are because they weren't always, and a lot of the women who I met with, that wasn't their experience, they hadn't been believed, but if women are believed about what they've been through, then they felt they were immediately reduced to a status. They stopped being a person and they started being a victim. And this came with a lot of expectations, but was also very negative. They didn't feel like they were being seen as people. Everything was focused specifically on the fact they're a victim. It's also a status that people can't claim. It has to be granted by an authority. So a criminal justice system or a doctor who says, yes, you have PTSD. You can't say yourself you're a victim. Someone else has to agree. And it comes with expected behaviours and needs. And this feeds into a lot of the research around ideal victims and ideal rapes and how people should respond and how people shouldn't, which then overlaps with a lot of the rape myths and stereotypes in society. But there's also this expectation that if you are given the status of a victim, you're expected to want to get rid of it and move away from it as quickly as possible. Otherwise, you get judged for not recovering quickly enough, not engaging with agencies, going along with what they want. And a lot of the women's words, they spoke about this idea of, right, we've accepted you're a victim, now what are you going to do to get over it? But they didn't feel they were supported in what they needed to actually move forward. So I included some quotes, which I think illustrate this from some of the women, I should say, i.e. the pseudonyms that I use. So Casey was saying that at first she really felt she was being dealt with as a person, a whole person. And then when the topic of her sexual violence experience came up, suddenly, no, she was treated as a diagnosis and seen completely differently. Dee spoke about, in order to try and have all her needs met, not just the bits that were specifically related to the kind of criminal justice bit of her experience of rape, she had to compartmentalize herself. So I go to the police to try and get formal justice. I go to my doctor to get medication. I go to a therapist to talk about it. I go to the DWP to get money. I've got to go to Mind to get this bit done. And as she says, it wasn't a holistic approach to recovery. And to kind of compartmentalize herself into all these different needs was really untherapeutic and exhausting, because it meant she had to have 20 agencies involved rather than one or two. And Ginny said that there was this expectation that she should move on and get over it. They think that by now, after all these years, you should just be able to take your brain out, wash it in the sink, put it back in. That's how she saw what people were saying about, yeah, but we've accepted it happened to you. When are you going to move on and get over it? So that was victimism, which seemed to be one concept that explained all the negative responses that women felt they were getting from agencies. That wasn't just blame, it was all this other stuff as well. Responsibilisation was this other concept that came up quite early. It wasn't something I'd heard of. Apologies if this is something you're familiar with, but it was quite a new revelation when I came across it. But it's this idea that everything that we go through, individuals are fully responsible for it, particularly in terms of well-being and safety. So it's a way of absolving others or the state of any responsibility for the well-being of its citizens. And it's deeply linked with neoliberal ideologies and a big part of the West in terms of how we conceptualize and respond to social issues such as crime. And as I say, it takes responsibilities of pretty much everyone else. It's down to the individual. You've got to avoid this from happening to you, but if it does happen to you, you've got to respond and get yourself better and get what you need and move on. So it maintains the status quo and the social order and it stops us from being able to blame or criticize institutions or the state. And if we had another hour, I would share, I previously did a presentation on police social media responses to sexual violence and the murder of women, and the number of tweets that I could share that show responsibilisation. Well, she shouldn't have been walking here. She should have known not to get in the car with him. It's just endless. It's endless. It's endless. If women want to be safe, they should know the law and they should do this and they should do that. It's just once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. It's kind of a strange process. And because it can attach to anything, it's incredibly insidious and adaptive, and it's normalized. We don't really question it. You know, that we often use the comparative example with victim blame. You know, if someone says, oh, I had an awful day, my car got stolen, your first thought might be, where did you park it? Did you lock it? Did you leave anything in it? You know, we're instantly thinking of what did the individual do? And partly it is a safety mechanism, because we can think, oh, well, I wouldn't park there. I wouldn't have left the keys in the car. I wouldn't have done that. I can feel safe. But it's just such a normal reaction that we often don't notice we're doing it with ourselves or with each other. And in some ways you can, you know, I've toyed with this idea of calling it the new victim blame, because I guess this is what's actually happening. But actually, I don't know if that's helpful, because it expands far beyond victims, as my research kind of showed, because women said that they felt blamed for things directly related to the sexual violence, so how they reported it, for not recovering quickly enough, for needing support at all, for how they engage with agencies. But they're also blamed for things that had nothing to do with sexual violence. So for their health, for their parenting, socioeconomic status, their housing, their relationships, their education, pretty much anything that someone could be blamed for, women felt they felt judged and blamed for that by professionals. And it put them into what Professor Maddie Coy has described as choiceless choices, this idea that it's a bit like with domestic violence, well, you should leave. Yeah, but I can't leave because I have nowhere to go and I'm much more risk if I leave. Oh, well, she says she's not going to leave, so we can't help her. Women are put in a rock and a hard place where the choices that they're given to make neither serves them. Some could actually be quite dangerous for them, but then professionals can say, well, they're not ready to help themselves. They're not ready to go along with what we need them to do. And again, just as with victimism, as with blame, these things are woven through a lot of these structural inequalities, as well as gender. And some of the quotes I'll include show how they really link in with stereotypes around race and ethnicity and age. So Casey, again, was kind of saying she felt that she was in this responsibilisation cycle almost with professionals, because she spoke about abuse when she was quite young. And people said, well, why didn't you tell people immediately when it's happening? And she would say, okay, well, because I was young, I was living at home with the person. I couldn't, you know, I was worried I wouldn't be believed at school. I was 12. But then they'd also say, well, you know, why did you wait so long to tell people? You're now 16, 17, 18. So it was a catch-22. But then if they do that, if she did, whenever she'd reported, people would say, are you sure that's what happened? Are you sure it wasn't a misunderstanding? And whatever she did, it would all catch up with her and it would make her sick. It made her ill anyway. Ellen spoke about, particularly dealing with healthcare services, that she would make an effort for appointments because she wanted the appointment to be as successful as it could, and so she'd make an effort to be clean and tidy and have everything organized. And then she got discharged because services thought she was functioning and she was fine. And this was at a time when she was acutely suicidal, but because she made the effort, everyone presumed she was okay. And her quote was really interesting because it also shows that women sometimes self-responsibilize. So she blamed herself. That was the mistake I made, not the crisis team should have seen that actually I wasn't doing okay, that, you know, just because you can put on a clean shirt and you can have all your notes ready doesn't mean you're okay. But she self-responsibilized and she spoke about, if I did it again, I'd do things differently. So we internalize these messages as well. And a common theme that came up again and again was this idea of, I was given 10 weeks of counselling, so that should be all I needed. I'm not better after 10 weeks, so that must be my fault. Not questioning, well, I was only given 10 weeks of counselling. What's 10 weeks going to do if I've been through years and years of childhood abuse? So that was a common thing, again, this kind of self-responsibilization. And again, this idea of choiceless choices. Kirsty spoke about knowing quite a few women in her community who weren't going to speak up because if they were at home, then they'd have a roof over their children's heads, they'd have money, they'd have those basic life amenities. Because once you speak up and once you leave, she felt there was no support and you're on your own and you're on your own with your kids. So again, it's that rock and a hard place. Shide spoke a lot about feeling that there was a real racial and ethnic component to this as well, that the police would respond in one way to women from white communities, but from non-white communities. And I'm being very vague because the women I met in this focus group were from a very specific community. And by kind of describing the community in too much detail, I will be giving them away and potentially their location. But because they were not white women, basically police said, oh, that's what happens over there. It's cultural, it's this, it's that, really dismissive racial assumptions and stereotypes. And then they wouldn't do anything to support these women. And Beverly spoke about age, you know, that she described herself as an older woman, and, you know, from being a child, generation after generation, the idea that you get over it, you get on with it, it's mind over matter, just get on with it. And when she went to see her doctor basically said, well, you've been dealing with this for like 50 years, shouldn't you be over it by now? So it kind of reinforced this idea of at some point it should just not affect you anymore, and you should just get on with it. So one of the things I was interested was are these things communicated, and how are they enacted through agencies? And the commonalities was there was 4 main types of agency interaction, or 4 main aspects rather, through which victimism and responsibilisation were communicated to women. The first, which is perhaps the most obvious, was through individual staff, so particular comments, things that staff did or didn't do, things around gender. So a few women spoke about, for example, a male police officer or a male counsellor coming to see them. And the interesting thing was they said, it wasn't that I particularly would have felt more comfortable with a female counsellor, or it wasn't that I didn't feel comfortable speaking to a male officer, I just would have liked to have been asked. And they didn't even think, they just sent a man in, or they told me to go and see a man, and nobody thought that might be difficult for me. And that to them communicated that they didn't matter and they weren't worth the time and the value of thinking about those things. So I found that really interesting, because for some women, if they were asked, oh, the officer on duty's Tom, are you okay seeing a male officer? That felt good to them. They'd say, yeah, actually I am, thank you for asking. That was what mattered. But there's also processes and policies, and a lot of women spoke about being put on a long waiting list for anything, you know, and all agencies, of course, have long waiting lists at the moment. It made them feel like they were just a number, they weren't a person anymore, and that they didn't matter, and that they'd be got to when they were got to. And for a lot of women, and this is, you know, I think in something we've thought about in the counselling service where I work, is we don't say to people, our waiting list is just a waiting list. We don't assess people in terms of who deserves it faster or need or anything like that. It's a waiting list. But people don't know that if they're not told. So they might think, oh, the reason it's taken so long to get to me is they don't think I'm important enough. There's other people who should be seen first. And again, if you're struggling with your self-esteem and feeling okay in yourself, and you're making that, that's the meaning you're making from being on a waiting list for a year or 18 months, that's just going to make everything worse. Some of the applications for support, the processes people had to go through themselves felt traumatizing, felt really difficult, whether that was trying to get financial support from the DWP, or the process of giving video statements and interviews and having to go again and again to the police and over things again. That in itself felt really victimizing, but also just that they didn't matter. And what we need is the evidence and the data. You actually don't matter. Physical spaces and equipment, so rooms being cold, rooms feeling like interview rooms, like cells essentially, rather than warm spaces, equipment not working, places not being private. All of this, again, made people feel that, well, it doesn't matter, I'm just a victim, you know, I need to suck it up and deal with this myself. And there was this interesting idea of kind of expectations of services. So before women had even got to the point of contact, this feeling of, well, what if they don't listen? What if social services just criticize my parenting? What if the police think, you know, that I'm making it up? So they went in with all these expectations that some of it came from reputation, and the media right now, it seems like every day there's something about an agency that's let down victim survivors in some way. So before they'd even got there, they were way more sensitive to all these other aspects, because they were expecting to be responsibilized, blamed, judged, and dismissed in some way. So I'm looking at the time. I'm going to quickly run through these. I think this time I said about Twitter bits. Thank you. Thanks, Grant. And I'd forgotten I'd actually included some in, because obviously I did want to talk about Twitter. But I think this was interesting because this was all coming out while I was doing my PhD, and it really hammered home, this isn't something that I'm just finding with these women in this setting. This is something that's happening. And so these comments about the awful murder of Sarah Everard made by I think it was the Police and Crime Commissioner at the time, about, you know, she shouldn't have been arrested, she shouldn't have allowed that, she shouldn't have submitted to that. And then when he was accused of victim blaming, he doubled down and said, I'm not actually blaming, but what I'm just saying is women need to be responsible, to know their rights and know the law and do this. So then he went straight into, if not victim blame, responsibilisation. And I think that just shows that even people who know the systems and know the law and should have an understanding of how these things happen, it's so easy to blame and responsibilise and make it the fault of the victim, or make it women's responsibility. You know, nothing in any of those tweets talked about male sex offenders' responsibility or police responsibility. It was all about women who might potentially be victims. And the same in the awful murders of Bibaa, Henry and Nicola Smallman is the same thing, that when they were reported missing, the police took an awfully long time to find them. And if I remember rightly, it was actually the family that found them. They went and searched for them themselves. And this was the two women, this is their mum, Mina, speaking. She said, basically, they looked at the address and they thought they knew who she was. She was a black woman living on a council estate, and they didn't bother looking for her. So this responsibilisation around, basically the families have to do their own investigation and find their own poor daughters who've been murdered, but also the victim blame and the victimism of their black women. So they're further down the hierarchy of victims. So we'll get there when we get there. It can be 36 hours. We're not in a rush. So again, it just shows how insidious all these different processes are and how they're woven not just into criminal justice, but actually into the media reporting as well. Because it was interesting seeing these comments in interviews and not always being picked up on, not always being pulled out. Hang on a minute, why are we saying it like that? Why is it being sort of framed like that? And one of the things, this is the kind of final piece, I'm in the home stretch, you'll be pleased to know, but one of the things that I was interested in is, well, how do I make sense of these two concepts? How do these fit? Because they obviously interact. They're almost two sides of the same coin. If we give you victim status and we go, yes, you're a victim, but you now need to take responsibility and stop being a victim and get your stuff together and get on with it, basically. And I came across this concept coined by Nancy Burns in a really interesting paper where she talks about patriarchal resistance. So this idea that actually these concepts all work together and maintain and protect the patriarchy and the status quo. And the problem with the victim blame as a concept is it doesn't acknowledge any of that. So again, I work in counselling services. We often have training about victim blame. We're told what not to say, what to say. You know, any interventions are focused on us and making sure we don't have victim blaming attitudes and that we don't say things that could be heard as blaming. And by focusing those interventions at individuals, it does nothing to change the structures, the systems, the policies, the processes, the governments that put all of this in place. You know, it's really very low level intervention, and it doesn't make a difference. The thing, I guess, about responsibilisation and the way of understanding that it's a much more pervasive way of actually devaluing women, and I do think it's a very gendered concept, it is part of this patriarchal resistance. So I say Nancy Burns uses this term to describe a series of processes that all interlink and protect the status quo and the gender order. And these two concepts, processes, they interact together to reduce the number of recognised victims that society sees as being victims to as few as possible. So people are either disbelieved or dismissed because of who they are. If they're believed, they're expected to get rid of that status as quickly as possible. And by taking this kind of approach, it simultaneously denies men violence against women because we're saying, well, there aren't that many victims, but it's also making women responsible for preventing and managing it. And Nancy Burns talks about degendering the problem and gendering the solution. So by looking at this, it maintains this gender order by not acknowledging what's happening. And again, the brunt of the work comes to the individual victim survivors to resolve what's happened and to move forward with their lives with minimal support. And agencies are frontline of this, you know, because they enact this patriarchal resistance and these mechanisms of patriarchal resistance and power hierarchies through their structures, through their policies and processes, through every aspect. And as I say, even physical environments was complicated in what the women shared with me in these focus groups. So to give an overview, I think part of the reason that there were so few examples of direct victim blame mentioned in my focus groups, I think partly it's because we recognise it and we've been calling it out for a long time. So I think on one level, people know not to directly blame people. And I don't think that's because of an attitude shift. I think that's because we've been told not to do it. But victimism is something that reduces people to a status. It stops people being seen as a whole person with all these needs and wants and thoughts and feelings. They're just seen as a victim and they're treated as a label rather than a person. Responsibilisation is a much more pervasive way of blaming women, but also people from marginalised communities. And as I say, I'm really interested to extend my research to look at this more, because I'd be really interested to know how male victim survivors are treated and how they experience these processes, because I'm sure they're victimised and responsibilised. Victimised isn't the word. I'm sure they experience victimism in the same way and are responsibilised, but I imagine it takes a different form. And I'd be very interested to know what kind of form male survivors are dealing with. And again, all these processes continue to maintain this focus on victims rather than targeting perpetrators in any meaningful way or looking at institutions and society. So from a criminal justice perspective, it's just what some people would call a pump handle response. It's just band-aid level intervention again and again. And it maintains what people like Liz Kelly, the conducive context for violence against women, the normalization of violence against women, rape culture. These processes maintain it and actually enable it to kind of keep flourishing. They don't challenge it and they don't make things any better for anyone. So I guess there's some very, very brief final thoughts. This is where my head is at the moment, thinking of future research. I think it's important that we interrogate other taken for granted concepts like victim blame and try and look at it from a wider perspective, because I really wasn't expecting to get to where I did in my PhD. Like I say, I thought I'd have a lovely, neat, probably a chart, a diagram, lovely CBT bit of kit that I could use to share with people and agencies and clients and go, this is victim blame, we can do all these things, then we stop doing it. And that's not what I found. It exploded out into this huge, many-limbed beast. And by doing this, we can then understand other forms that patriarchal resistance takes and how these also interact and how they stop us from meaningfully addressing and tackling men's violence against women. And I'll finish with a quote, because this was actually one of the first things one of the women said in the first focus group. This was Beverly, and she was a fabulous Irish woman, so I can hear her voice and her accent as she said it. And I said, well, what was it about your interaction with the police that was difficult? Can you share that? She goes, everything. It was everything. It was how the sun shined. It was everything. And then she went into the detail of it was how they spoke to me. It was the fact it was male officers. It's the fact I was in a cold room. It was the fact I was made to feel like this and this and this. But I thought that just summed it up, that actually with these concepts, it is everything. And that means it's really important for us to understand them, because just focusing on blame, we're going to keep missing the key aspect of what's actually going on and what's stopping victim survivors from getting justice, but also what's stopping them from engaging with systems, because people know this is what they're going to experience. It's enough in the media, it's talked about enough, so we can tackle it if we know what's actually happening, is my hope anyway. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to finish. I've got my email address. If people have any thoughts or questions after today, please do get in touch. And I can share the slides with yourselves as well, if that's helpful, because I've also got some references if anybody wants them. So thank you very much.